Good afternoon. I'm going to be brief. I'm out of practice at this. But it's a real honor to be able to introduce Dave Bartholomae today. He's a distinguished graduate of Rutgers' own program. But he's lived and invented for himself an extraordinary career in the profession that in itself is worth thinking about. Last year, College English published an article that celebrated the 25th anniversary of the publication of Dave's article, Inventing the University. This is the single most important essay that's been published in the profession. It's the most cited essay. It's shaped programs. It's shaped how people think about writing. And it also speaks to a moment in the profession when it was possible to have an intervention like that take the form of an essay rather than a monograph. One of the most impressive things I find about Dave's career is that it is driven by the essay as the measurement of intellectual expression, not a book. And Dave is an extraordinary essayist, and his collection of essays won the Mina Shaughnessy Award in 2005 for the most important contribution to the teaching of writing. So that's MLA's highest prize. He's also been recognized by the ADE for outstanding contributions to the profession. He's won the Exemplar Award. So he's recognized as an outstanding teacher and scholar, and he's done that with a commitment to writing as his subject, and most specifically student writing. Dave's career has been committed to an idea that he repeated this morning, which is if you're not teaching student writing and teaching students how to read student writing, you're not teaching writing. And he has always made sure to place student writing at the center of his work. He calls it literature with a small L, the literature of the everyday. He's directed the writing program at Pitt for more than a decade. He then went on and served as chair of that very complicated and distinguished department for 14 years. He has the single most important textbook in the history of the profession of composition, Ways of Reading, which is now in its 10th edition. That's a lot of books. And so one of the ways you can measure Dave's intellectual accomplishments is that he has really set the reading agenda for thousands and thousands of students. And he set it against a fundamental assumption of people who teach writing to beginning students, that you should start slow, start small, start easy, and then eventually they'll be able to read something difficult. And Dave has refused that assumption about the best way to teach, and that the best way to teach is, in fact, that you begin with difficulty. The fundamental essence of the act of reading is an encounter with difficulty. And so he put Ways of Reading together with the kind of text that actually graduate students were struggling with at the time. He included an excerpt from Foucault's Panopticon in one of the early pieces of Ways of Reading. So he never backed off from putting really, really challenging work in front of first-year undergraduates. Inside that is a profound commitment to the idea that education is and can be transformative. But it can only be that if we actually commit ourselves to teaching the people in the room. So in order to do that, Dave has not been someone whose career has been driven by the monograph. He's had an extraordinary career, and we talked at length about it this morning, about the possibility of having a career in the profession that is driven by the monograph as the gold standard. It's a very restrictive standard we've committed ourselves to. If we imagine that intellectual insight can be expressed in things besides 350-page blasts of text. Dave's contribution to the profession, however, in the realm of the monograph, I think is unequaled. One of the other facets of his intellectual career has been a commitment to being the co-editor of the series at Pitt that publishes, I'm biased here, of course, but publishes the best work in the field of composition. The work there is highly rewarded, recognized by the MLA, by the 4 Cs, and it has made careers in the field possible because publishing in this field is difficult, and the options are few, and the larger part of the profession is more committed to, I would say, either a more expressivist version of composition or a more mechanistic one. And at the core of Dave's intellectual project is a commitment to the liberal arts. Dave's essay that is standard reading in all composition programs, Inventing the University, is an apt name for how he has carried forth his career. He's invented the kind of university that I was attracted to, and he's invented the kind of university for other people to work in, where students are the center of our focus. Thank you.
Hey, Richard, give me back my talk, would you?
Oh, I just wanted it to be shorter.
So thank you. So I'm honored to be invited as your alumni lecturer. My experience on this campus was, to tell the simple truth, for me both life-changing and unforgettable, and my debt to Rutgers motivates my talk today. My subject is teachers and teaching, and I want to begin with the 1970s, when I was here as a PhD student, from fall 1969 to fall 1975. In my talk, I plan to look beyond the 1970s, but only briefly and only in passing. This talk is part of a larger project with a broader reach, but I just don't have time for all of it today. I'd like to take a minute to mention friends from my era in the PhD program here at Rutgers. Stuart and Leslie Michener. Leslie's now editor of the Rutgers University Press. Dick Bruscher, Bob Atwan, Don McQuaid, Bruce Hertzberg, Pat Bazell, Linda Flower, and Greg Waters, who's here today, my old pal with his wife, Terry. Many of these folks went on to have significant careers in my field, composition, a field whose literature and concerns were completely absent from the graduate program at Rutgers in the early 1970s. And so here's a surprising fact. If you're willing to equate influence in a field with the numbers of citations, a recent analysis shows that 3 of the 4 most influential scholars in the field, that is from 1980 to the present, were students in the PhD program at Rutgers when I was here, where once again composition was not a topic of study and hardly even a topic of conversation. I went from Rutgers to the University of Pittsburgh, turning down a job as the Victorianist at Boston U along the way. I went from a dissertation on Thomas Hardy to a career in composition and rhetoric, a trajectory that seemed baffling to many of my friends and teachers, but which seemed sensible to me then and seems sensible to me now. So let Rutgers and Pittsburgh stand as placeholders. I want to think about a line of force in the teaching of writing that begins with the creation of English studies at Cambridge University in England in the 1920s, and that connects a number of other institutions, including Amherst, Harvard, Rutgers, and Pittsburgh. The line I want to draw links people and places that are not part of the usual accounts of the history of composition in the US. I rely on the phrase line of force because I'm not setting out to write intellectual history or to tell a story of influence. I want rather to trace a set of common concerns as they enabled work at different institutions at different moments in time, and in particular as they enabled certain forms of teaching. I take the phrase from the opening sentence of Richard Poirier's surprising essay Learning from the Beatles. Let me read it to you. You should have a handout. The handout, because I'm going to deal with a number of passages, you'll see them in the handout, so I'll wait 1 second. And they're numbered for ease of use. So this is from, and I'm assuming everybody knows that Dick Poirier was, of course, director of graduate studies when we arrived, and he was my teacher. He was, at that point, everybody's teacher. We all took a required introductory course with him. So here's from Learning from the Beatles, and it's number 1. I'm proposing that a line of force in literature, beginning with some American works of the last century, and passing through Eliot and Joyce to the present, has offered a radical challenge to customary ways of thinking about expression in and out of the arts. And I'm further proposing that because this challenge hasn't been sufficiently recognized, criticism, especially as practiced in the university, where it should be most exploratory, simply fails to give an adequate reading to some of the very texts it cares most about, and shows almost no capacity to cope with what are considered less distinguished ones placed under the heading of popular culture in films, advertising, TV entertainment, the music of the young, or dance. And the voice in my head adds, or student writing. Damn it. That should be part of this list. Because this challenge hasn't been sufficiently recognized, criticism as practiced in the university, where it should be most exploratory, shows almost no capacity to cope with student writing, or with the teaching of writing. It's not a huge leap to include student writing as one of the less distinguished genres in front of us, one more genre to which criticism must learn to attend. And this is how I read Poirier, as if we were talking about the same things, sharing the same concerns, and arriving at the same conclusions. And this way of reading does violence to his prose. Still, this is how I read the work, completing sentences by turning them my way. And in my own writing, I'll confess, I've taken titles from Poirier's essays as my own, or knowingly or unknowingly I recall or cite or I channel or appropriate his sentences and paragraphs and put them to use on a subject composition that he did not or could not or would not reference. I've told this story elsewhere, so I'll keep it short here. Richard Poirier was my first and in many ways my only writing teacher. I took his required first-year seminar, Introduction to Graduate Studies, and because I found him to be such a commanding presence, I started to read his work. A World Elsewhere, The Place of Style in American Literature, where I learned to think of style as a form of energy, a force or counterforce running like a current inside sentences, at least the best of them. And then I began reading the essays that later became the performing self, compositions and decompositions in the languages of contemporary life. I was taken first of all by the prose, which demonstrated as well as argued that writing was an action, an activity, these are his words, an activity, an agitated, often dislocating effort to appropriate and change the reality it confronts. At its most alive, he said, writing exemplifies the kind of effort that can and needs to be made by anyone who proposes to make more than submissive sense of the world as it now is. This was a concern Poirier brought to the work of Mailer, Pynchon, Eliot, or Frost, but it was also applied to the regular short papers we wrote for his course. On mine, he would often write in the margins, "Don't do that." He was teaching me to see a sentence as a gesture, as indicating a way of being alive in the world, one that I would do best to treat with suspicion. And I knew exactly what he meant. They marked moments when I was most trying to be a good graduate student, a would-be professional, going on and giving in rather than questioning or resisting or postponing expectation as I moved confidently toward an inevitably rounded conclusion. I had to chuckle when I read through the remarks collected in the memorial edition of Raritan, a journal he edited for so many years. The editor had asked contributors for comments on Poirier's role as an editor. Mark Edmondson wrote, this is number 2. He was very formidable and at the start a little scary. He pushed me early on to stop writing like an assistant professor. Then in time, he nudged me away from a style that he thought too pop. He was a great stylist himself, and he understood, I think, that developing a style was about developing a sense of yourself, who you were, and what you might be and do. And that's what I heard Poirier saying to me. Don't write like a graduate student. Don't do that. Don't be that person. He characterized my prose by asking me to consider its central character, some version of myself as a young intellectual or a young professional. Who do you become when you talk that way? Who do I become, your reader, if I take you seriously? These are questions I carried to the margins of my own students' papers, a pedagogical move made possible by the example of Bill Kohl's, one of the other great teachers in my career. Stop writing like an assistant professor. Don't be disciplined by the discipline. Find a way to be present rather than absent inside your sentences, within the genres of academic work. Bill Kohl's would say to his first-year students, stop writing like the 1,000-year-old man. You sound like the Jolly Green Giant. Don't be such a phony. I.A. Richards characterized the voice he heard in students' papers as, for instance, oh, the expert on the real world. In my first years at Rutgers, I spent long hours copying out difficult and impressive sentences Poirier had written in order to get the feel of them, to try to understand them from the inside and to understand what they were doing. I can state it simply in retrospect, but it was not simple at all at the time. I did this as a writing lesson. What did I learn? I learned to use dashes and parentheses and semicolons. I learned to put common words in brackets or quotation marks, to call attention to both their necessity and my uneasiness in using them. I learned how to introduce and to interrupt and to follow a long block quotation. I learned to put big words in capitals, to create allegories where responsible critics, capital R, capital C, became obstacles in this pilgrim's path. I learned how to work with the words of others, but also to feel the need to get my own word in edgewise. I learned to write with a minimum of footnotes. I tried for a whole semester to write a paper using the word language as he had used it in talking about how language worked upon Appleton House. I felt that I had gained access to a profession by exercises such as these. At the time, it did not feel like surrender. It was inspiring to feel that I could use this language and imitate as best as I could his way of reading and writing. At the end of the Frost book, Poirier calls upon Thoreau to make a point about a writer and his field. And this is number 3. How does anyone know beans? More perplexing still, how does anyone know that he knows them? This is a question set and answered by Thoreau, and with more subtlety and less show-off wit by Frost in his poems of work and in the work of his poems. The answer is that you know a thing and know that you know it only when work begins to yield a language that puts you and something else, like a field, at a point of vibrant intersection. At my best, I felt like I had entered, at least briefly, such a point of vibrant intersection. It's an experience I continue to work toward as I write. Although as I have been writing for a long time now, it gets harder and harder, and what I hear most is repetition and parody. I remember very well how shocked I was when one of my other professors, after admiring a paper I had written, said, "Don't you ever get tired of that Poirier routine?" This is a true story, but of course it's also a story I was being prepared to tell, a story that is told over and over again within certain circles to make a point about writing and about a writer's education. Henry Adams tells it of his class day oration at Harvard, where an eminent uncle noted that, as the work of so young a man, the oration was singularly wanting in enthusiasm. Adams notes that, this is from the Education, he was ready to stand up before any audience in America or Europe with nerves rather steadier for the excitement, but whether he should ever have anything to say remained to be proved. This is from The Education, a book that was crucial to Ted Baird in his teaching in his early days at Amherst. Roger Sale tells another version of the story in his book on writing. Sales was out of graduate school at his first teaching job, and in his first teaching job at Amherst College, where he worked with Ted Baird. He was carrying on, he says, about something when a colleague asked, "Why do you want to talk in that boring way?" For Sale, the message was, quite simply, I did not know what I meant most of the time I spoke or wrote. And after that, writing got harder and harder. The story is rehearsed again and again in Bill Kohl's book, The Plural I, and I'll have more to say about that book later. It's a story that summarized the program for the teaching of reading and writing at Amherst College when Poirier himself was there as a student, and then later as a young assistant professor, and then at Harvard, where with Reuben Brower, also formerly of Amherst, it informed a fabled general education course, Humanities 6. It's a story that circulates still in the composition program at the University of Pittsburgh. It informed a pedagogy that prepared students to closely read their own and each other's work and to characterize it, to give to student writing the time and attention usually reserved for the literary text, to ask, who does this sound like? Where does this language come from? What does the speaker know? How does he know what he knows? And who do I become when I write like that? When these questions were being asked at Amherst in the 50s and 60s, composition was learning to ask questions of a very different sort. What is your purpose? Who is your audience? What do you want to say? What form of organization would best serve your aims and purposes? These are fundamentally different questions, and they define a different form of education for a young writer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So I've been writing about Poirier as a writing teacher, mine. There is, however, a pedagogical imperative throughout his work, one whose object it is very hard to name or to define without using a word like composition. I want to show you what I mean. This will take a little bit of time, and I'll be relying on only two of his books, both from the 1970s, the book on Frost, The Work of Knowing, and The Performing Self. I have not done anything like a comprehensive study of Poirier's engagement with undergraduate teaching, which would require archival work at Harvard and Rutgers. I knew Poirier as a professor in a graduate program. He kindly sent me some assignments he wrote at Harvard in the 1960s, but I know very little about his relationship to a department, its curriculum, or its undergraduates. In the era of demand and Derrida, the era of big statements and specialized vocabularies, Poirier was an anomaly. He wrote in an ordinary language, few endnotes, if any, few references to critics or scholars, and he insisted that his subject, too, was ordinary, everyday. He insisted that his subjects were reading and writing, small r and small w, rather than literature and criticism, capital L and capital C. It was as though these big words belonged to a discourse he could never quite share and never fully enter, at least not seriously or willingly. As I read his work, and I say this with admiration, he had one fundamental point to make about reading and writing. Reading and writing as a form of action, as performance. And he made this point over and over again by means of dazzling demonstrations, readings of key passages from key texts, texts that engaged and repaid his attention. And he wrote these readings out as performances of his own, where the admiration for the work he was presenting was matched by the energies and the odd rhythms in his prose. He provides a series of dazzling readings, all meant to demonstrate what it meant to be alive as a writer, or a dancer, or a composer, or a singer, or a teacher. And these were applied to a quite daunting range of materials, a range that continued to increase until the end of his life, and that moved beyond classic literary text to include forms of high and popular culture, from the Beatles to Bette Midler. His work suggests that this was the only way to teach the work of knowing, by setting out to do it again and again, by providing demonstrations to show that it can still be done, and that the need is as urgent as ever. The struggle to be present in language, to know that you have known something, requires repetition, the same thing over and over, but with a difference and with a continued sense of purpose. It is the application or the constant struggle that keeps the method alive and in circulation. Here's how Poirier says it with Frost as his point of reference. And this is number 4. To hit the right channel between believing too little and too much is to be always more or less in carefully navigated motion. It is the motion in the writing and the reading of Frost that I try to account for in this book. And I hope my interpretations are saved from inflation and summary by his own interpretive restlessness. Sound and metaphor in his best writing, prose as well as poetry, are the loci of energies, not signs of meaning, ultimately to be enforced. Poirier would often turn to the gym for his metaphors, talking about muscle memory achieved through exercise and repetition. This lesson, he says, is something athletes know, as well as laborers of a certain kind. To do any job well requires the capacity to concentrate on the labor with a full and simultaneous awareness of the different orders of experience that are brought into play. Still, it takes an effort of will to bring this passage to the work of student writers in a composition course. Even though he insists, as he does above, on the pairing of writing and reading, the classroom he imagines is one where students learn by reading. This is the opening to the work of knowing. To some extent, any poem is an act of interpretation, an inquiry into the resources of the language it can make available to itself. Reading is an analogous act calling on its own literary resources, which may at times be greater or less than the poem's. It's not that this is an odd twist, that you learn to write by reading, that this is his language, that the expenditure in the writer could generate a corresponding energy in a reader, and that this energy would carry over again to the student who at some time will be writing on his or her own. In some ways, it was a commonplace in the 70s to think that the reading of literature would have inevitable and beneficial effects on student writing. This is a pedagogy with a long history. Poirier's argument, however, stands well outside the usual commonplaces about the value of literary study in the 1970s. Each of his books insists upon this. His is not a trickle-down theory, nor is it a form of the new criticism. He argued for a very specific and determined form of work with certain kinds of texts and with very local rewards or consequences. His attention is to the sentence and to style, and these were not the usual points of reference when first-year writing courses were built around a standard set of literary texts. Poirier's 1970 collection of essays, The Performing Self, takes as one of its subjects the undergraduate curriculum in English. He challenges a reader to turn to and to think about the scene of instruction. In its final sentence, he calls for a new curriculum, one that can answer to the energies he described in the book's preface. And that description is number 6. Writing is a form of energy not accountable to the orderings anyone makes of it, and specifically not accountable to the liberal humanitarian values most readers want to find there. Energy which cannot arrange itself within the existing order of things, and the consequent fear of it, which takes the form of repressive analysis. These are what make the literary and academic issues I shall be discussing inseparable from larger cultural and political ones. Writing is a form of energy that at its best is resistant, uncomfortable, out of the mold. This is the key to understanding the relations between writing and schooling, where the discomfort, the mismatch between expectation and practice, is the condition of the classroom and the starting point for instruction. A similar argument was being worked out in the late 70s in the composition community. You think, for instance, of Richard Oman, English in America was published in 1976, or Mina Shaughnessy, Errors and Expectations, was published in 1977. And as he is writing about a new curriculum, he's unable to avoid the fact of student writing. This pressure comes to a head in his essay, What is English Studies? And if you know what that is, what is English literature? This essay has been a touchstone for me. I've taught it and returned to it many times. In it, Poirier asked this question. This is number 7. What then is anyone to do who thinks of himself as a custodian, not so much of language in the abstract, but even of his own language? How can he begin to dislocate language into his own meaning? I think it's important to hear the word anyone in that opening sentence. What is anyone to do who thinks of himself as a custodian of language? The case is not being made only on behalf of genius or those of proven critical sophistication. It's not being made on behalf of graduate students or English majors, or at least not only on their behalf. I remember Poirier once asked us to prepare a writing assignment, something we would use in teaching Antony and Cleopatra. And I asked, well, what about the audience? Was this to be an assignment for a freshman English class, a class for English majors, a graduate seminar? And Poirier answered, I tried to do his voice, well, what difference would it make? The argument he makes pertains to anyone who hopes to be a custodian of his or her own language. And I think it's important to hear the word custodian as it calls up vocations both high and low. And then he turns to writing as a matter of technique. How can he, a writer, begin to dislocate language into his own meaning, not to have it appropriated by the meanings that circulate powerfully? And then he moves to his conclusion, where he can't not speak to the broad concerns of an education that takes seriously the problems of writing. Locating, then watching, then describing, and participating in this struggle, the struggle for verbal consciousness, as it takes place in the writings of any period, could be the most exciting and promising direction of English studies. It points to where language and history truly meet. Literary study can thus be made relevant to life not as a mere supplier of images or visions, but as an activity. It can create capacities through exercise with the language of literature that can then be applied to the language of politics and power, the language of daily life. And he goes on, driven, I think, by the necessary indeterminacy of his key terms, capacities and exercise, to imagine again a pedagogical encounter. It is simply terribly hard to do this, however. This is number 9. To make this shift of muscularity of mind and spirit from one allegedly elevated mode of expression, where the muscles can be most conveniently developed, to another mode of expression, both more inaccessible and considered so ordinary, so natural as to be beyond inquiry. And yet in this transfer of activity and the reciprocations that follow from it is the promise of some genuine interplay between different and multiplying cultural traditions, including, I would add, the difficult interplay between the work of students and the expectations of the academy. He goes on, and I'm going to compress the final argument by working with just short passages, and this is number 10. If English studies is not in command of a field of knowledge, it can be in command of a field of energy. English studies cannot be the body of English literature, but it can be at one with its spirit, of struggling, of wrestling with words and meanings. It can further develop ways of treating all writing and all reading as analogous acts, as simultaneously developing performances, some of which will deaden, some of which will quicken us. The emphasis all in all is in the original, and it's essential to the argument, since Mr. P is worried that readers will be mentally editing out certain acts of writing and reading as beneath or beyond the range of reference. Once on its way, this activity can be applied to performances other than those occurring in language, to dance and sports, as much as to film and popular music. English studies must come to grips with the difficult languages of popular culture, with newspapers, political speeches, advertising, conversation, the conduct of the classroom itself. Until proven otherwise, none of these need be treated as if it were necessarily simpler than any other or than literature. The same hard questions for all. And so I ask, why is there no more direct reference to student writing? Poirier was, I say I'll remind you, but it's part of a bigger thing where I had reminded you of this. But Poirier was closely involved with Humanities 6 at Harvard, an undergraduate course. He writes about this and about the course at Amherst in Poetry and Pragmatism. And this course, Humanities 6, was defined by a regular sequence of writing assignments, exercises they were called. Composition becomes a necessary term in this essay, and yet the course that carries its name, a common term, is unacknowledged. The same hard questions for all. Why is it so difficult for Poirier to represent students as writers and not just as readers? Or to imagine that students could learn these lessons by writing poems or by writing prose? It's not as though composition or creative writing were unthinkable as courses in an undergraduate curriculum in the 1970s. They may have been unmentionable, but I don't see or hear Poirier expressing such conventional disdain. Why is composition absent? One simple answer, I think, is that Poirier was unwilling to let his subject be co-opted by the emerging professional field of composition. Composition with a capital C, and with its own emerging account of what writing is, how it relates to the traditions of literature, who writers are, what they do, and how they learn. Remember, Poirier is equally determined to distance himself from literature with a capital L. He doesn't want to be a part of that institutional location either. I'm inclined to say that he is determined to find a language that will preserve some form of reading and writing instruction in the lower division, to preserve it as an area of primary concern, and yet still not divide English studies into literature and composition, capital L, capital C. He's imagining something different, or trying to imagine something different, something like a department of performance. And composition, in fact, becomes a necessary term to articulate this vision of the possibilities of English. And this is number 11. We ourselves, each of us, and anyone is one of the key phrases or a key term. We ourselves, each of us, insofar as we are composed in and by language, should be as much the subject of literary studies as is any literary work similarly composed. The confrontation of these two kinds of composition should be the substance of our work. It is murderously hard work, however, except for those who take for granted the self known as the reader, or for those satisfied with the almost invariably slapdash compositions of a self put together for any given discussion of political relevance. It is terribly difficult to find out who one is during an act of reading, or to help a student find out who he or she is, and perhaps it is harder now than ever before. It's terribly difficult to find out who one is during an act of reading, or to help a student find out who he or she is. I've wanted to fill in the blanks in order to put writing into this sentence, but I don't have to. Listen rather to this. It should sound very familiar. This is number 12. Every year I make a new sequence of assignments dealing with a new and different problem, so that for all concerned, teacher and student, this is a new course, a fresh progression in thought and expression, a gradual building up of a common vocabulary, a more precise definition of terms. And though I have never repeated an assignment, every assignment I have ever worked with, every question I have ever asked involves the same issues. Where and how with this problem do you locate yourself? To what extent and in what ways is that self definable in language? What is this self to judge from the language shaping it? What has this self to do with you? Style, writing, language, composing the self. These are the terms this teacher is trying to bring into play as the key terms of a composition class. The document goes on in the same fashion, struggling to say what it's difficult for a teacher to say. This is number 13. I wish to make clear that the self I'm speaking of here, and the one with which we will be concerned in the classroom, is a literary self, not a mock or false self, but a stylistic self, the self construable from the way words fall on a page. The other self, the identity of a student, is something with which I as a teacher can have nothing to do, not if I intend to remain a teacher. That there is a relation between these two selves, between writing and thinking, intellect and being, a confusing, complicated, and involving relation indeed. This is undeniable. This relation, in fact, is the center of both the composition course as a course and the course as more than that. Ideally, hopefully, primarily, our concern is with words, not with thinking, but with a language about thinking, not with people or selves, but with languages about people and selves. This is taken from a course description addressed to students taking a first-year composition course. I've taken it from Bill Kohl's 1978 book, The Plural I, a book which provides a narrative account of a first-year writing course at Case Institute of Technology, now Case Western Reserve. Here's more. This is number 14. The subject, the content, or however you want to describe it, of this course is writing. Writing is an action. It is something you do. It is not something you know about, except in the same more or less ineffective way you know about health or you know about the symphony. You do know, for example, that good writing should be clear, coherent, and somehow pleasing to a reader. But how to make your writing clear, coherent, and pleasing is another matter altogether. Here's an excerpt from a course description Poirier had prepared for Harvard's Humanities 6 in the 1960s. This course, we might recall, is an action, not a body of material to be covered. The action of the first half year is learning how to read and how to communicate the experience of reading through writing. Our whole aim is to secure a higher level of attention to works of literature, to get the student to confront this particular work and discover the satisfaction that comes from attending. There's no sacred method, as students suppose, for achieving this kind of attention. As I read these passages, I'm hoping you're hearing the echoes between Bill Kohl's and Richard Poirier's prose, and not just in the argument that writing is an action, or that what is at stake is the self, a self that can be found only in sentences, providing a momentary stay against confusion. That's the refrain. But I'm also hoping that you see the similarities in the rhythms and the style, the use of capital letters, the way the language turns back on itself, and the usual ways of thinking and talking. Even the titles rhyme. The Performing Self, 1970. The Plural I, 1978. I want to be clear. I am not suggesting that Bill Kohl's learned from, drew upon, or was in any way indebted to Richard Poirier or to Poirier's work. I doubt that he read Poirier's books, and I think I would have known. I knew Bill well in the 1970s. I was his first hire at the University of Pittsburgh in 1975. I went there to be his assistant director of composition. We worked together closely for about 6 years, and after that we remained colleagues. I can remember vividly how odd it was in that first year. Although we had no apparent connection, it was as though we shared a common mission and a common language. Bill thought of himself as a maverick, self-made. I thought of myself as clueless, completely unprepared for the job I had taken. And yet we shared a language and a focus that made our work more than collegial. I don't know how else to describe it. We were secret sharers, part of a close circle. And when it came to teaching or reading a student paper, to teacher training or curriculum design, to writing an assignment, there was some deep connection that often eliminated any need for warm-up or for explanation. Bill Kohl's didn't talk about books like The Performing Self. He didn't work that way. The sources he claimed as reference points were always odd and surprising and determinedly outside the range of what a professor of composition was supposed to be reading. He found the professional literature on composition almost impossible to read or to admire. But whatever he read with composition on his mind, and so books that made no obvious connection were read in such a way that they became crucial points of reference about teaching and about the composition class. If you were smart enough to make the connection, to understand that the sentences spoke to you. Poirier and Kohl's were part of a circle whose circumference I don't quite know how to draw, but whose center point was clearly Amherst, and in particular a freshman writing course, English 1-2, directed by Theodore Baird, and a sophomore reading course, English 1920, which provided, through Reuben Brower, a model for Humanities 6 at Harvard. These courses provided a powerful, definitive, definitive, and sometimes troubling experience for teachers and for students. Amherst remained a crucial point of reference for Bill Kohl's throughout his career. The course description I cited earlier is based on a course description developed at Amherst over time by its faculty. Kohl says, "Few teachers have had the experience of seeing either how the student's writing or the activity of working with it can be made into something to be believed in." And he goes on, page 16, or number 16, excuse me. "I had been so privileged. I was fresh from having taught 5 years at Amherst College, where in working with Professor Theodore Baird, I had experienced an approach to the teaching of writing that I had seen enable teachers to find themselves as teachers. The approach, it sounds so simple, was one based on making the student's writing and not something else, and the student's writing as a form of language using the center of the course. Recall for a moment Humanities 6, where students reading and not something else, that's the phrase, was to be the subject of the course. I should take a moment to gloss the parenthetical, not something else, as it functions in the plural I. The reference is deliberately vague, since its composition in the 1970s was searching for a content, something to write about. But among its references is the composition course that centered on a collection of literary texts. My colleague, Mariolina Salvatore, uses Kohl's to represent the general argument at the time that literature was not an appropriate subject for a course in composition, that students in writing courses had been harmed by a literature-centered pedagogy. Those are her words. Throughout his career, Bill Kohl's argued that the primary text of a composition course had to be the writing of its students. In this sense, anything that would take time for this, like the weekly discussion of a novel or a poem, was forbidden. As he was developing a composition program at Pitt, he was correct in arguing that faculty, including graduate assistants, knew how to fill up a class period discussing a poem by Frost. They did not know how to talk about a student paper, how to give it attention, how to value it. And their preparation as writing teachers required that they learn to do so. At the same time, Bill was proposing what you would have to call a literature-centered pedagogy. If by that you mean a pedagogy that insisted on a close attention to language and whose values were derived from literary criticism in the Cambridge tradition, which is different from the new criticism. The course in the plural I featured assigned readings, usually but not always short passages. Sometimes they are used to call up a way of speaking, a discursive field, and students are asked, what happens if you talk like that? Where do you end up? But sometimes they are offered as models to emulate or as cruxes to represent fundamental writing problems. A long passage by Darwin functions as the former, an extended passage from Salinger provides the latter. The key terms in the analysis of writing, that is in this course that Kohl's represents, the key terms in the analysis of writing were voice, metaphor, and stock response. As such, they extend or put into play the key terms of the Cambridge Project as articulated by I.A. Richards. The attention to tone was powerfully inflected or redirected by the presence of Robert Frost at Amherst. Frost, too, is an important presence in the line that I am tracing. In the course at the center of the plural I, students learn to see that words or phrases that they take as true, fixed and transparent, are in fact slippery and metaphorical in their relation to the world. This was the lasting point made by Frost in his lecture to students at Amherst College, Education by Poetry. This is Frost now. What I am pointing out is that unless you are at home in the metaphor, unless you have had your proper poetical education in the metaphor, you are not safe anywhere. Because you are not at ease with figurative values, you don't know the metaphor in its strength and its weakness. You don't know how far you may expect to ride it and when it may break down on you. You are not safe in science. You are not safe in history. And they learn to judge character, which in this pedagogy is evident at the level of the sentence by attending to voice. Here again is Frost. The ear is the only true writer and the only true reader. I have known people who could read without hearing the sentence sounds, and they were the fastest readers. Eye readers, we call them. They get the meaning by glances, but they are bad readers because they miss the best part of what a good writer puts into his work. So I want to take a moment to tell you about the Plural I, a book I'm assuming you have not read, and that I'm taking it upon myself to promote wherever I go. The Plural I is a narrative account of a first-year writing course, complete with copies of students' papers. It's organized by means of the writing assignments that define the course, 2 each week in a 15-week semester, and a narrative recreation of the classroom discussions prompted by the presentation. The discussions that were prompted by the presentation are 2 or 3 of the students' papers. The assignments define a sequence, this is Kohl's, a fresh progression in thought and expression, where a nominal subject, in the case of this course, an exploration of the difference between amateur and professional. The real subject of the course was language and its users. Where a nominal subject is investigated from one angle and then another, the sequence is both repetitive and incremental. Let me describe its opening and closing. The first 6 assignments ask students to think along with 2 key terms, amateur and professional. The course begins with questions of definition in order to call attention to the problem of meaning. Meanings don't reside in words. Words are put into play by writers trying to say something. They struggle to communicate, to make the words meaningful to themselves and to others. The better the writer, the more self-conscious the struggle. And so the opening assignment begins not by asking students for a definition, what is an amateur, but by giving them something said, words already in play, and by asking, as he always asks, where and how do you locate yourself with this way of speaking? To what extent, in what ways is that self definable in language? What has this self to do with you? In this course, papers are reproduced for each class, and students learn to give close, critical readings to the language on the page. At first, it's quite simple. Who's speaking here? Who do you have to be? Who do you have to be to take this language seriously? Writing that is routine or empty, submissive is Poirier's phrase, is called theme writing with a capital T. As the semester goes along, the forms of close reading become much more subtle, the critical positions much more complicated and compelling. The first paper presented for discussion opens as follows. You'll just hear this, you don't need to read it. And a single sentence is enough to recognize the paper and its version of knowledge. It's the standard opening of a first-year writing class. The question of the amateur's place in a society of professionals is one that has greatly been changed by the scientific and cultural revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. In introducing the discussion in class, which is represented in the book through dialogue, Kohl says, and this is number 19, I began, as I generally do, with the question of voice, not as a way of suggesting that writing is speech, but to get students used to the idea that sensitivity to words on a page is analogous to one's response to the tonal variations of the spoken word, a response that for all of us, whatever difficulty we may have in describing how we hear what we do, is immediate and full. The concept of voice, then, involving as it does the feel of words, can, after a time, become an appropriate metaphor for the life of writing, or the lack of it. What sort of voice speaks in this first paper? I asked after reading it aloud with the students. How do you characterize it? What's your response to what you hear? I don't have time to work through the discussion in detail, but I recommend this book to anyone who teaches writing or who thinks of himself as a custodian, not so much of language in the abstract, but even of his own language. Here's Kohl's summary of the outcome. None of the students with this first writing assignment behaved any differently from what I expected. Triumphs of self-obliteration, the papers were. Put-up jobs, every one of them. And as much of a bore to read as they must have been to write. I found myself being talked to as though I were a rube, though it may perhaps be thought by my reader. Unoffendable, it has probably never been a matter of concern to the reader, or a confederate, someone in on the joke of why none of it mattered. Of course, we in a college classroom can hardly hope to settle the question of. No observation was too trivial to escape oratorical pronouncement. It's unfair to call the amateur a clumsy bastard. No moral stance too obvious to assume, After all, professionals are not necessarily good people. So far as the proposition was concerned, the students handled it in the way that a theme writer traditionally handles a theme topic, as a moral issue on about the level needed to condemn the man-eating shark, which is to say, inside a moral vacuum from which all living concerns are carefully excluded. There wasn't one student who convinced me that he had a modicum of interest in anything he was saying. By the end of the course, the critical lens is turned to the students' knowledge of science. These are students at a technical college. Assignment 25 is entitled Explaining a Scientific Law to a Non-Scientist, and assignment 27 is The Humanities as a Requirement at an Institute of Technology. Let me quickly outline the conclusion to the sequence. The intellectual questions become increasingly more complicated. The student papers become increasingly more interesting, more thoughtful. More and more often, there is an interesting person who can be found on the page, usually only momentarily, in a crucial sentence or in a throwaway sentence. The critical pressure of the figure of the teacher is relentless, funny sometimes and compelling, but relentless. The final 5 assignments are, to my mind, brilliant for the ways they engage students with the relationship between ordinary and specialized languages, between language as language, something shared, where communication is a reasonable desire, and language as it stands for any of the powerful because technical ways we have of organizing knowledge, feeling, experience, and understanding. Here's Kohl's at the end of the course. I had hoped that the assignment would put the students into the position of recognizing that whatever their examples, it was a language about the world of experience and not the world of experience itself that they were considering, which would in turn be a way of seeing that the value of that language, of such a structure, lies precisely in the fact that it is a structure, autonomous, self-consistent, self-contained, not capable of translation without becoming other than what it is. This is a serious course that has gone some considerable distance. It is, to use Frost's terms, a proper poetical education, a training in ear reading with attention to tone, and through it to something you could probably call an introduction to the philosophy of language, not far from that which is proposed, for instance, by Stanley Cavell, who also fits in this circle that I'm imagining. At the time of its publication, when composition was beginning to develop a set of methods, a literature, and a constellation of stars, the Plural I proved to be largely unreadable. Those who reviewed it or wrote about it or spoke about it at meetings pretty much missed the point. For one thing, the book requires a sophisticated ear, but it's also difficult, it was at that time difficult, to read a book that blurred the genres. The Plural I is both fiction and report. It's narrative nonfiction, a genre that now is part of the stock and trade of every MFA program in the country. But in the 1970s, when composition was turning to ethnography, looking for a positive scientific access to the classroom or to student learning, its audience was poorly prepared and predisposed to file the book outside the categories of scholarship, to see it as touchy-feely or as a narcissist memoir. So I'm running out of time, but I'm determined to bring I.A. Richards briefly into this account of language teaching. From 1922 to 1921, Richards was a lecturer in the newly announced program of English Studies, the English Tripos, at Magdalen College, Cambridge, where with his college he was charged with developing and justifying a new curriculum, one that at first glance seemed either absurd or superfluous, the study of one's own language. And this to adults, including men who were coming home from the First World War. There was then a sense of urgency and expectancy. As Richard says, when they first began to discuss the curriculum, their primary concern was, what could we talk about without disgracing ourselves? For several years, and these were his first years as a lecturer at Cambridge, Richards would distribute printed sheets of poems, usually 4, ranging in character from a poem by Shakespeare to a poem by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. He did not identify the author and did not indicate any kind of preference or order among the group. He asked his students to comment freely in writing, and he would collect these responses, and in the following week, while he would lecture on the poems, he would, as he said, lecture rather more on the student responses, which he came to call protocols. He was not out to explicate poems. There's no evidence, in fact, that he would provide the final word or a final correct reading. The project was to think about poems and literary language more generally as instances of communication. Communication, the problems of language use, these were his subjects. The project, he said, was a piece of field work in comparative ideology. The account of all of this is in Practical Criticism, a foundational text for modern English studies. Richards gathers these students' papers around him, the protocols, and not unlike mine O'Shaughnessy in Errors and Expectations, his first move is to organize them according to the principal difficulties of communication represented by the students' responses. There are 10. Of them, I'm most interested in the critical traps that surround what might be called stock responses. Here's where Richards leaves psychology and turns to what we would now call the ideological forces at work in reading and writing. Stock responses are, Richards says, energy systems, which have the right of entry unless some other system of greater energy can bar them out or perhaps drain their energy away from them. The button is pressed and the student author's work is done, for immediately the record starts playing in quasi or total independence of the poem, which is supposed to be its origin or instrument. Stock responses, he says, are purely prudential uses of language. That is, a writer or a speaker may be using words not because he knows with any precision what he means by them, but because he knows how they are ordinarily used, and he does with them what he has heard other people do with them before. Kohl's, remember, calls this theme writing, writing that is empty, routine, thoughtless, inattentive and adrift, content to repeat the usual commonplaces. Poirier refers to it as submissive. For Richards, Poirier's, and Kohl's, writing is a game played for mortal stakes, hence the King James cadences and the apocalyptic visions of death and waste. Here is Kohl's in the Plural I. Did experience, shaped in the terminology, this is the 23, did experience, shaped in the terminology those writers had used, really continue to exist in some throbbing, human fullness somewhere outside that language, in contradistinction to that language? And to go through life theme writing one's experience into bloodless abstractions. We had a swell time. It was a great trip. She was really cool. Was to end up with how much of life having dribbled through one's fingers. Yes, the habit of theme writing was a choice, I concluded class by saying, but maybe not always a free one, and maybe not one that remained open forever. My point is a simple one. Practical Criticism, The Performing Self, The Plural I, although these books are seldom, almost never read together, they speak to each other. They belong in the same circle. They're at home together. And because of the very odd coincidences of my graduate training at Rutgers, I quickly felt at home with them. And I know, I'm a student of Frost. Home makes you crazy. It sends you out into the woods at night. Still, Frost says, home is where, when you go there, they have to take you in. These books and the books they entail share a language and a style. They represent the persistence of a focused pedagogical project. Or once upon a time, Kohl's and Baird or Poirier and Paul Demand were sitting around a table working on a first-year course, drawing upon shared terms and practices that were transmitted outside the usual professional routes of books and journals and seminars and conferences. The people around that table did not rely upon a specialized vocabulary, tegmemics or topoi, Kleineman or kenosis. The work was not meant to define a career or to define a field. It was teaching. These teachers relied on ordinary language to carry out a critical project, to do something beyond the ordinary. And those who did this teaching believed the critical project could be taught to others, to anyone, including the young. I worry that composition is losing that ambition and losing that lack of ambition. losing that focus and those blurred lines, that freedom and that sense of obligation. When I think about composition, I continue to think about Rutgers, and I think about how odd that is. And I'm grateful that you took me in, that you gave me a chance to come back and to think about this one more time. Thank you.